This is Scott Erven. He's the Senior Managing Director at PricewaterhouseCoopers. He's in charge of their healthcare cybersecurity advisory practice. He has 15 years of information security experience of medical devices and medical infrastructure. He has advised the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the Food and Drug Administration, and now national policymakers. His research on healthcare was featured in Wired, Forbes, and the BBC. There are so many others that are not also mentioned in that list. He has presented his research internationally and at the most premier hacker conferences. He's also a subject matter and exam writer for numerous industry certificates, and he is involved in the development of the CIS security benchmarks for medical devices. Let's please give a very warm welcome to Scott Erven.
Great, thanks, Christian. Really appreciate it. And thanks to you and Jeff, first for inviting me to come and speak, and second for such an outstanding event yesterday. Like really, who was here for the afternoon simulations yesterday? Yeah, so it was incredible, right? Like that was one of the best things I've been a part of in the 4 or 5 years that I've been looking into medical device security. So thank you guys, for putting that together, and everyone else, like big round of applause for them. So back for a little bit, of insight into my background. Of course, Christian and my bio kind of introed a lot of the security and vulnerability research that I had done into connected medical devices, but, how did I get into that? Now, clearly, I'm a consultant, and, consultants, we don't like consultants, but no. I've come from a pretty diverse background. So not only was I a security researcher, but how I got into that was really I was working for a healthcare provider system. So I've been in healthcare and managed information security, for over 5 years of my career prior to coming into consulting for the last couple of years now. And that's really where I got passionate about this topic. So as I was in, the hospital, when it really hit me was we were starting to connect all of these devices, 5 years ago. So we were looking at things for population health management, quality of care metrics, data analytics. And that meant that we had to connect medical devices and put in some pretty robust medical device integration platforms. And as we did that, and as I looked at that, I said, wow, we've kind of bolted on connectivity to these devices. Are they secure? So that's when I really started to look into these things. The other piece of that, and working at the provider where I got the passion from, was my yearly review. So every year I would have to rate my performance on, 1 to 5 scale, not unlike other folks doing self-appraisals. But the challenging part for me was when it would get to, how are you, Joe Schmo, information security guy, having a direct impact on the organization's missions and values and patient safety and quality of care? And that was a tough one. Like internally, of course, I can write pretty good. I made up some pretty good things. But internally, to be honest with myself, that was a very challenging thing to answer as a security person. Of course, I try to protect your information, right? And I try to enable others. But when I looked at medical devices and I looked at identifying vulnerabilities, and then I looked at the ability to take that, to evaluate that, to work with the manufacturer, to actually get a patch resolved, that as we've seen yesterday, could result in an adverse event or even loss of life, that was very rewarding for me. And that's kind of, for me, like when I got so passionate about securing these devices that we were behind, and when I could actually answer truthfully that I had a direct impact on patient safety and my organization's missions and values. And so, please keep that in mind. Like we now, as not just physicians and clinicians, but as information security professionals for healthcare organizations with these devices, or as developers of medical devices, you've always had safety things. But now from that cyber component, you've now got that direct impact in your career. So I want to talk about, what have we accomplished? And when I mean what have we accomplished, I want to kind of focus on the last 3 years, when we really started to see some progression and the need to start doing things. So what have we accomplished so far? We've gotten fairly good with awareness to the issue, with various stakeholders. So that's, medical device manufacturers, whether they're those traditional medical devices or even some of those, new entrants in the mobile digital health space. Healthcare providers, regulators, there's clearly others. But what we were seeing is when I would go and talk to a healthcare provider or a medical device manufacturer 2 or 3 years ago, probably 80% of the time, the first thing in that discussion was pushback. This really isn't a risk. Nobody's going to do it. Who's going to do it? It's not going to happen. We're starting to get over that. And I'm not saying that, for every client I go to, even though I work with a lot, there's 100 others that aren't necessarily to that maturity. But overall, we've definitely made progress on the awareness because I very rarely get that immediate statement back from clients any longer. And these are things that, over on the left here, as far as, for background of the type of issues we see in those connected devices, these are what, we reference as kind of security hygiene issues. So some of the things in the vulnerability research that we found are, missing patches, outdated software support, hard-coded credentials, which was intentionally put in there for, clinical delivery, and we didn't really think about the unintentional consequences of security. Or not encrypting data in transit to back for support purposes, those types of things. We weren't doing it, which we could affect data integrity. So it was very simple things, and in many cases it still is, especially with legacy devices. But we do have a better awareness of the issue over the last 3 years. We've also got a lot better, stakeholder collaboration and discussion. So we see, numerous industry events over the last 3 years, whether it's, Suzanne's going to talk about some of the things that the FDA and her team has done as far as, holding now 3 workshops. But we also have other industry groups that are bringing peers together, that are bringing organizations together to have that talk. If you took 3 years ago, 3 years ago we started to talk to each other, but if you took 5 years ago, and in many cases, again, 3 years ago, you took a medical device manufacturer and a healthcare provider and tried to get them in a room to talk about this, it wasn't happening, right? And when you did, there wasn't that open, honest, sharing of information or sharing of problems. It continued to always be excuses and complaints, and we weren't opening up to solve those. But we're doing better with that now. We've also got regulatory guidance. So this was driven clearly by FDA, and we've come a long ways. We've got pre-market guidance. We've got post-market guidance. I think one of the incredible things that shows some of that forward progress with the post-market guidance is that piece of guidance went from draft to final in under a year. That's a big statement. And it went to draft from final in under a year. A safety communication was issued. And the critical thing to remember about that is we still don't have evidence that anything of this has caused loss of life. So that's different in many cases where we see, recalls or guidance or those types of things is we have that scientific base previously. We're taking proactive approach. FDA is putting out this guidance to try to stay ahead of the curve. So we are working, we are doing good things. We're also seeing this lens, partly from the guidance, partly from other things like, frameworks like AMI TIR 57, which kind of shows us how do we integrate cybersecurity into the existing quality process for the device manufacturers. And so when we look at it from security practitioners, we always try to say, we don't need to rebuild, the house. We just need to work with the stakeholders and identify opportunities to inject security into existing process. And that's what this is we can take security and inject it into an already risk-based quality program at a device manufacturer and be successful. So we're starting to see that. And where are we at? So we've got that awareness. We're beginning to understand what that takes, what it looks like to integrate medical device cybersecurity. This is an example for a device manufacturer, right? But we're starting to understand that we need to inject security at various points during the life cycle. Products that are in development now that I work with, for the most part, are much better And they are learning and they are improving. Now, for every client that I work with, there's 10 others that still haven't even came to the table. So it's something that we have to scale, but good things are going on. We understand now that we need to start looking at it in post-market, start looking at it in design and conceptualization. We need to do things such as threat modeling, right? We need to do risk assessments on these devices. We need to do control profile development so we can provide our customers hardening guidance. We see that all the way through the life cycle of testing and validation, all the way to getting the device cleared, and then post-market management of cybersecurity through like patching and stuff. So what I say when I say we're beginning to understand that, nobody's got this 100% nailed at all points yet, but conceptually we understand the path forward of what we need to do to integrate security in those devices. This is healthcare providers, right? We're also understanding how do you develop that overall governance structure for medical device security and solve it in your environments. And so we've seen organizations such as Mayo, right? So Kevin McDonald over at Mayo. We've learned some lessons in how they've looked at things over the last 3 or 4 years with them trying to solve this challenge. And so we look at that holistically from the life cycle of device from the provider perspective. And that begins with evaluation and vendor selection, right? So evaluation and vendor selection for providers, we're starting to learn that they need to be present during evaluation and vendor selection. They need you, physicians and clinicians, they need your input, because traditionally how we've done this is the physicians, the clinical staff have gone out and they've made a decision based on the product that delivers the best care, and they purchase that. And you should continue to do that. But what happens is then the contract is signed, then it gets to security, and security is all of a sudden a disabler for you. They say, oh, well, we can't do it this way. We need to take away functionality. We're seeing success when we're flipping that model and integrating that up front and partnering with physicians and the clinical staff during evaluation. Because at that point, we're not supplanting your judgment as a physician or a clinician. We're enabling you to understand the risk, things that you've seen yesterday. And you're still going to make the best decision. That's one indicator in the greater scheme that you were informed up front during that decision-making process. And ultimately, even if we choose the most insecure product, we're going to be better off than we are with today's process of not getting security involved later, because we're up front going to understand those risks that we've accepted and be able to try to mitigate those or set expectations through contracting with the manufacturer. So we see that early on all the way into implementing these devices and through kind of how do you implement med devices into threat and vulnerability management and scanning or incident response. We're also seeing how that life cycle kind of integrates and maps to that greater framework for like a medical device governance framework. And if you look up there on the wheel on the right, it's most of them not very unique, right? A lot of those are core IT security components of a framework. But it is important to sit down with these devices. Oftentimes I get an answer of, well, we're not going to write use cases for every single type of device or incident. But when it comes to medical devices that are connected, that can have an impact on patient safety, I think we owe it to ourselves to take some additional diligence and time to carve out some of these unique situations of, how do you scan these devices? How do you scale that without, tipping them over? How do you do that in a methodical way? How do you respond if a virus hit that to ensure that it didn't have a device malfunction and work with clinical engineering to make that happen? So we're getting there, right? And we do understand conceptually that this needs to take place. But even with all of this, these are some snippets from the HHS task force report that Josh called out yesterday. Right? There's still some significant issues. And for every Mayo, for every Medtronic, for every J&J, for every large organization that starts to conceptualize this and understand it, there's either a smaller startup or there's a small rural clinic. One of the things I like, I won't spend too much time on the left here, but one of the things I liked in the task force, over on the right, these are cutouts. And these are the cutouts for the specific portion of medical device security in that report. So in the first 3 columns, they covered out CIA. Well, I think they switched it up. Like, was it a gov report? You didn't want people to think they were being spied on, so you changed CIA to CAI, Josh? Hi. So confidentiality, availability, and integrity, right? So we're seeing the impacts there. But the thing on the right that they also did is showed impact of each of those to patient safety. And that is something different. That's that new lens that we have to now look through. And you can see almost all but two of those have the potential impact to patient safety for those risks. So we've got awareness, we're doing good things, we're conceptually understanding what we need to do, how we need to move forward to secure these devices. But what are some of those things that are holding us back? We tend to get, when we get in, our stakeholder work groups, we oftentimes hit an excuse or we hit a challenge. And that holds us back significantly. So we will see, for example, on excuses. One of those may be, well, I called the manufacturer and the manufacturer told me they can't patch it. And we put a period behind that. We don't continue to push that. Those that have been successful in doing that, push that. They don't take that statement necessarily for fact. They continue to work with the manufacturer. They work on an escalation procedure of, I'm going to contact the vendor. I'm going to tell them, hey, I've got some FDA guidance here. It seems to be fairly clear of what some of those expectations are. Could you go ahead and do a risk assessment? If it doesn't impact patient safety and you can show me some of that, maybe we don't need to patch it. But if it does, please, we feel that that needs to be provided. And they're successful. The manufacturers respond. It's a lever, and they've been successful. They don't accept that period excuse. Some of the challenges, right? So we've had challenges with, years ago when, on what we've seen yesterday, like AICDs or pacemaker technology, right? We had a problem with, building robust encryption on there. And sometimes we would hit this challenge and say, well, we can't throw all this PKI and all this stuff on the overhead because the battery is going to drain. We've gotten through that. There's now devices there. So the leaders in that space, they've pushed beyond that. Excuses and challenges are preventing us over the last few years and are leading to a lack of execution. And that's where risk reduction really happens. Risk reduction doesn't happen us, talking in events like this. Risk reduction doesn't happen oftentimes till later phases of execution. And when we stop and we make an excuse or we come to a challenge and we end that discussion and we don't dive deeper into those areas, we're doing a disservice, and we need to do better at that. We also oftentimes will see, especially from the manufacturer, from the provider side, from the InfoSec, parties here, the product, security team, is we now have that conceptual understanding, right, of some of the things that we need to be doing. But we don't yet have the lack of the C-suite, in some cases we do, or the board. And that's where these can be effective. We continue to sometimes try to solve this in isolation because we now have an understanding of what we need to do. We let excuses and challenges prevent forward progress. So I've got this thing up here of we fear, we wait, we want, we stop pushing. One of the big things is fear. I see a lot of fear of failure, right? We don't want to fail, so we wait. We should not. This is an emerging risk area. This is not an area where we have 10 years of proven successful methods to come up and build secure devices. So do not fear trying something new. Trying something new, if it doesn't work, do not think of it as a failure. Think of it as one other thing I tried and can eliminate in working towards that solution. So you shouldn't fear trying something new. What we should fear, and in some cases I think we are somewhat negligent as time goes on, is we should fear continuing to use known failed practices, right? That is what we should fear. We wait or we want. Oftentimes when I'm in, talking to clients, they want to wait. They want to be back there with the pack. They want to know what is everyone else doing and what is the standard for medical device security. There are very few. There are frameworks that can adapt, but you're not going to have a blueprint of exactly how to roll out medical device security for probably 10 years. It's just not going to be there. So we can't wait. And we need to stop pushing, right? So back to the example of device manufacturer can't issue a patch or tells me they can't issue a patch. Don't stop. Continue to push that. Continue to solve for better. So what do we need to do? What do we need to do to push it from good, to push it to better, to push it to best? I think we need to kick the crutch. So this is a thing of Darth Vader, and for some reason when I Googled kick the crutch, this is the first image that came up on the Google search. And it had, when I linked to it, it was a story from Gizmodo of how this random drunk guy dressed as Darth Vader had a metal crutch and went and beat the crap out of some founder of the first church of Jedi Church of England. So I want you to think about that, the excuses and challenges as we move into the tabletops or further, as you're at events like these. So today, this afternoon, when we're at the tabletops, if we get to an excuse and a challenge and we stop, I'm going to be switching over to my Darth Vader outfit, and I'm going to come out of the corner and beat you with the crutch. So please don't do that. Please work today and work this afternoon to solve some of these challenges, right? And think about that, mentally. Like, do I need to push this? Is this a period statement, or can we move beyond? Get involved in the business. So understand what levers you can pull for the sweeten the board, right? Develop that strategy, develop that execution plan. The most successful organizations that I see, who here loves going in and talking to the board? Excellent. He's CIO, so he's probably got it together. What I can tell you is that that's great, because the organizations that are most successful tend to use the board, and they tend to use even internal audit as a catalyst, as an ally. Instead of using it someone that just calls out weaknesses, they use it for improvement. And they're able to get in front of them, and they're able to get some of the resources that they need to start solving these challenges. So we need to do that. We really owe it to our patients. And it's important, again, to understand that even when we go into that boardroom and we finally got our message and we finally got approval, that no risk reduction has really taken place. We've gotten closer to understand how we're going to reduce that risk. We've got the money to reduce that risk, but that pump that's still out there still isn't patched and is still vulnerable. So risk reduction doesn't happen at that point. It doesn't happen until we start to execute, and oftentimes later in an execution cycle. Security researchers. So now we got a handful of us here, myself included. Right? Myself included. We need to do better. We need to be more empathetic, especially in the healthcare community. Right? We need to take time to listen and understand the challenges of healthcare and how those apply. It's very easy for a researcher, myself included. I've learned a lot. Even though I came from a healthcare environment and a healthcare background, I've done some things where I may have been inaccurate in a statement, or I said, you know what, it's as easy as pushing that patch to fix that problem, and I've been wrong. And as I've talked to individuals, that's when I start to understand that, of having empathy, right? Taking time to understand the ecosystem, working and talking to physicians, talking to clinicians, talking to clinical engineering on how they work with my security experience. We also need to work and move beyond just pointing. We're very good as security researchers in finding problems and finding and exposing weaknesses. We're not as good in showing how those necessarily impact in our environment to patient care, or better yet, challenging ourselves to work with the folks in the room to come up with innovative solutions. So not just going out and talking and saying, we found these vulnerabilities, but here are some of those things that you can do to improve and fix this. So we've got to get better with that. HDOs, providers. Continue to push outside the comfort zone, right? Don't stop at, they told me they couldn't fix it. Don't stop at XYZ Healthcare told me they were trying to implement medical device vulnerability scan, and it was a horror story, and all of these devices blue screen. Because the ones that didn't stop there, they are scanning medical devices in the environment, right? They are doing that. Now, it's methodical. They're just not going willy-nilly, but they've developed a scaled, methodical approach to test those out of production, then to bring them in, to make sure that patient safety wasn't impacted. They've been successful. They didn't take that story and say, we can't do it. Begin to solve problems that don't solely require manufacturer assistance. Because oftentimes I hear providers on the excuse of, well, it's the manufacturer's problem. And they take that as that period statement. And they don't even move to start solving those things. Do things that you can, even without their cooperation, while you're trying and we're working towards new devices that are secure. Asset management's a huge one, right? So who's clinical? I know we had some clinical engineers, biomed folks. Yeah, couple. So they typically have, for asset management, they're like, we got that covered, right? And yeah, for the most part they do. Joint commission requirement. So if you go to them, they can tell you, I have 762 infusion pumps in this hospital. That doesn't mean a whole lot from an IT incident response thing for a provider. So what I'm talking here when I say asset management is IT asset management, to understand where those devices reside on your network, looking at components of those devices, classification of those devices. So from the IT asset management thing, we can do that without the manufacturer assistance. We can start doing risk assessments to those devices from a classification perspective. Because if you go and talk to clinical engineering, and you ask them if they do a risk assessment, they say, yep, we've done a risk assessment. You have to drill down further, because they do a risk assessment. It just doesn't necessarily include that cyber component. But you can talk to them, and you can sit down, and they've classified devices, and they can tell you what devices are most critical as far as an impact to patient safety if the device was to malfunction. And so a cyber is just one element of that. You can do that, because if you do that, and you say, tends to boil up, just a hint, some of those devices that we did simulations on yesterday tend to be some of those most high-risk devices. But as you do that, then you can focus some of those resource effort and kind of condense that scope of what you need to focus on when it comes to connected medical devices and implementing security. Continue to utilize contracting. We've got to do that. We are starting to see that. Mayo Clinic's been very verbal about the things that they've done. There are dozens of organizations now that have been successful in getting contracts in the MSA language to set security baselines or set expectations with the manufacturers. Now, if you talk to the manufacturer, it's a pain for them to respond to 100 different types of contracting language from a manufacturer, questions from a manufacturer on security. But if you take an honest look at that, it has also enabled them, and I see this, to go to the board and to say, our customers are now demanding security as table stakes for us to get the sale. So it is effective. It does work, so continue to do it and utilize it and set expectations for all parties. Device manufacturers, right? We've got to look further. We're starting to do it. At least the large medical device manufacturers are starting to integrate. But it is not a well understood or defined thing of injecting cybersecurity into the existing quality process and filtering that down to have that consistent quality process with the cybersecurity components injected into that. So continue to work for that. Continue to understand and leverage that customer requirements. Again, it is, I understand, a staffing issue, and it's not scalable to come up with everyone's minimum security baselines, but use that as an advantage. It does have influence. So continue to use those customer contracts to show that you need to deliver security in the product. Continue to use things like the Department of Defense, like RMF, or risk management framework that's coming out. We're starting to see that in contracts now, right? Those are contractual requirements that have to take place in order for you to sell a device and connect it into a DoD network. So use that to your advantage. And continue to inform and train and bring awareness to the engineers and developers. So who here works for a medical device manufacturer? Who here writes code for the medical device or is an engineer? Nobody. So the people that can directly impact some of these things are not in the room. So we've done a better job of increasing that stakeholder collaboration. But things like yesterday of getting that physician and that clinical influence and increasing that stakeholder group. Or that example right there. We don't have the engineers, we don't have the product developers that are creating these devices at the table. We need to continue to inform them, right, and show them some of these risks. Physicians and clinicians, like, we really need your involvement. We need your help. I think yesterday was a great example in showing that, right? It was super helpful for me to see things, and I think it was enlightening, for the physicians to kind of see, some of those simulations play out. There's some good things that happen when that takes place. There's things that we couldn't even discuss. So one example I know with Christian, with Jeff, the last few weeks, I'm not saying this is a solidified example, I'm just trying to share something where when this, collaboration with physician happens, events like yesterday happened. That was the first of its kind. But outside of that, we've talked over the last few weeks, and one of the challenges, to get back to a challenge from the last couple of years, was how do we handle authentication? Because when we go to physicians and we say, what functionality do you need during emergency access? The immediate answer is, we need full access, period. And we take that, we don't push. But we sat down and we've had some conversations the last few weeks. And so if we look at that AICD simulation yesterday, right? So we've talked about if you need to go into a failure mode or an emergency mode, in the future, is there a potential to carve out some of that functionality? So who watched the sim yesterday? Right? Did that physician at any point need right access to that AICD to deliver emergency care? No, he did not. Those are the types of things as we push that I think, I'm not saying it's definitely a clear-cut, push beyond it, but it's something to think about. So physicians and clinicians, I also challenge you, we need your help. When we come to you and we ask you those types of questions, please think about this after this conference. Please don't stop at the answer of, I always need always-on access for emergency care. Please take the time to sit down with us to solve through these challenges. Because the more connectivity, functionality we can reduce, it's going to have an impact on patient safety now. So the last thing is, that patient neglect for physician ease of use is not an acceptable risk. So we've got to solve for better. Everybody. We oftentimes get and see individuals, when we're in a room, we say, you don't understand that. We're in healthcare. We're so unique. We're the unicorns. There's nobody like us. And we stop. We put that period statement there. It's not 100% the truth. There are some uniquenesses to medical device security and how it relates. But don't use it as that period statement. Continue to solve for better. And lead the pack. How many physicians and clinicians are in here? Okay. So how many of you yesterday was the most kind of awareness or training that you've had on cybersecurity as it was related to medical devices? A handful of you, right? So how many of you, 4 or 5, think you're medical device cybersecurity experts? None of you. The reality is, we need your help. We need you to lead that pack. You guys, gals, that were here yesterday now have 8, 10 more hours of information about the ramifications of cybersecurity in the medical device than 90% of your peers that are practicing medicine. You have to be the leader. You don't think I'm an expert on medical device cybersecurity, but you're way more informed than the majority of your peers in this area, just from yesterday's events and today. So we need you to lead the pack. We need you to be the leaders. We also need, for medical device manufacturers specifically, for healthcare providers, we need you to share your success. We're starting to see successes being shared, right? We're seeing Mayo. I've seen, for example, like Medtronic, give a good talk on how they're doing risk management. I've seen, Abbott get a talk on how they're now starting to integrate PKI and solve some of these challenges. And that is excellent. We need more of sharing the success stories, because for every one of those, that helps you. I mean, you are leading that pack. That helps every startup. That helps every rural clinic improve the time and have a baseline of what success looks like so that they can